Welcome back to Subversive Preacher. My name is Cameron Miller, and this is a sermon for the 16th Sunday of Pentecost. The texts are Genesis 50, 15 through 21. It's the end of the Joseph story when he shows mercy to his brothers who betrayed him. His dad long dead. And then in Matthew 18, 21 through 35, where Peter asks Jesus if there's some jerk in the community, how many times does he have to forgive that guy? And Jesus says 77 times. So this could almost be titled Forgiveness Number 2, given last week's sermon about forgiveness, except this is about mercy and forgiveness. It's a sermon, if you've followed any of these sermons, that you've probably heard 100 times before, dozens of times from me. It has elements that are new and other elements that sound like same old, same old. But it's also a little complicated too. Because you see, we have two topics that seem as though they are the same, but which are very different. Mercy and forgiveness. Joseph gives mercy to his brothers, while Jesus urges the practice of forgiveness to his friends. Mercy and forgiveness may seem like the Siamese twins of the Bible, but truly they are not even identical. They're not even fraternal twins. In fact, they are two different categories of relationship and healing. So starting with Joseph, these big fat Old Testament stories have some juicy morsels in them, but they are almost accidental to the grand narrative. Sometimes when we read these Hebrew texts, we get overly interested in the subplots, but it's the bigger story that's really more important. If we get caught up in the details, it may cause us to focus on a little current over here and miss the surf that's coming in. But with Matthew and the Gospels, it's kind of the opposite. Matthew's story is simple. It's a simple little parable that was turned into something much bigger and more complex, and our objective is to dig in and find little bits of ore. So I'll start with Matthew and the familiar reminder, as I always do about parables. Jesus and the other itinerant rabbis of his generation taught in parables. And parables were pithy little stories with one single simple point that was aimed like the tip of a spear to get stuck in the brains of their audience. The story we read in Matthew today has a parable hidden in it somewhere, but in the telling of it, as it is passed down over a couple generations before Matthew ever writes it, the simple little parable morphed into a complex allegory. The point of Matthew's allegory is that God is like a king who forgives his slave of an impossible debt. Then, in the complexity of the story, the king discovers the very slave whose debt was forgiven did not model the king's generosity. And instead, that slave had a fellow slave imprisoned and tortured because he was owed money. Now that sounds counterproductive, but in those brutal days, they tortured debtors to find out if they were hiding any money. It was a pretty grim system. So, in Matthew's allegory, God is the king who forgives our impossibly huge debt. The slave is us if we do not forgive those who have trespassed against us. The slave's punishment will be our punishment, as the allegory goes, with each character and event reflecting the promises and the threat of our relationship with God. We too will be tortured and if we behave badly, presumably tortured in hell and by fire. According to Matthew's allegory, God's forgiveness is conditional and completely dependent upon our forgiving others. That kind of logic and conditionality makes sense if we believe that God is a cosmic judge or stern parent holding a big, horrendous, fat paddle in his hand. But to me, such a God sounds suspiciously human rather than the God and creator of the cosmos. But don't take my word for it. Think about Jesus. He was a populist preacher and teacher, a revolutionary, talking to peasants who were brutally oppressed. If we keep that miserable social context in mind, it's really hard to imagine Jesus saying, well, you know, God's like a king who threatens imprisonment and torture to those who don't do what he says. For peasants living under the Roman Empire and abused by their local corrupt tyrant, Matthew's description of God is just more of the same. Who needs a punitive tyrant running the cosmos when there's that kind of tyrant running their own lives? So underneath these stories, we will see that a truly powerful God exercises mercy more than forgiveness. By contrasting Joseph with the Jesus parable hidden inside Matthew, we will see something interesting about mercy and forgiveness. In Joseph's day, and still in Jesus's too, there was a culture of blood libel. We hear this commandment, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and we think it's primitive and vengeful. But in its time and in its place, it was radically progressive. Because you see, the rule of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was that if you kill my little brother, I don't have the right to bring my clan into your village and wipe you all out, only your brother. Retribution had to be proportional. So, taken in that context, an eye for an eye was an improvement. As a law and custom, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth reigned in unrestrained brutality and violence of the blood feuds. But Jesus takes an eye for an eye teaching, and he refines it with the parable that we can imagine is hiding underneath Matthew's allegory. Jesus declares that mercy is a higher value than vengeance. Mercy, in fact, replaces even measured retribution as the core value of Jesus' community. We hear that talk about mercy and we say, well, duh. But our own institutions and laws and governance still don't grant supremacy to mercy. Jesus was preaching forgiveness as a radical strategy that would free the minds of brutalized peasants from the toxic consequences of bitterness and resentment, as I spoke about last week. But here I feel the need to make a caveat that I hope I've made before, because it's one thing for Jesus to preach a strategy of forgiveness to his peers, and a totally different thing for institutional religion to preach the same thing to marginalized people. Why? Because the church as an institution preaching forgiveness has more often than not been the tool of oppression. Christianity as an institution begins as a tool of Caesar's to inflict unity and require conformity. And then the Roman Catholic Church becomes an inquisition inflicting horrid violence on its world. And the Anglican Church becomes a partner in British colonialism to rape indigenous cultures it colonized. And the Episcopal Church tagged along with the U.S. government to convert the leftovers of Native American genocide and then became major perpetrators in violence and abuse. It's a very different thing for powerful institutions with a history of violence against their subjects to insist that their victims forgive and forget and show mercy than what Jesus was doing when he was talking to his peers. Only those with the power to execute punishment have the ability to show mercy. Victims cannot show mercy toward their abusers unless the power arrangement has been reversed. And herein lies the difference between forgiveness and mercy. While forgiveness is something that all people can practice, mercy is something that implies a power differential. Mercy is a gift granted from one person who possesses the power to give it to another person who does not have the power to grant mercy to themselves. But as I said last week, forgiveness is not a gift. Victims of oppression can practice forgiveness, but when they do, it's not on behalf of the perpetrator, nor is forgiveness a gift to the perpetrator. Forgiveness is a strategy to free the heart and the mind and the one who has been wounded and abused. Forgiveness is a strategy for those who have been transgressed against so that they can move forward without the corrosive effects of resentment that only does injury to themselves. Jesus does not suggest we give anything away when urging us to forgive. Rather, he's recommending a strategy for healing. Forgiveness, as Jesus teaches it, is not a moral achievement, but rather a protocol for one's own healing and recovery. Forgiveness is not an ethical principle or a test of our moral purity. It's a tactical maneuver in spiritual warfare. As we read about forgiveness and mercy in the Bible, we need to always remember this context. Joseph could show mercy only because he had power. He exemplified forgiveness earlier in his life when he used it to free himself of the bitterness and the hatred he had toward his brothers for their betrayal. But later on, when he was powerful, he could grant mercy. And perhaps he did so because he had earlier practiced forgiveness. Likewise, Peter asked Jesus how many times he has to forgive some jerk in the community. And Jesus answers 77 times. What he is really saying is, well, how long do you want to suffer under the effects of resentment and bitterness? Peter's asking for a rule, and Jesus gives him a functional strategy for living. How much acid do you want in your heart? But again, forgiveness, as I said last week, is not a rule or a commandment. It is a strategy for healing, and it's a weapon of spiritual warfare. Unlike mercy, forgiveness is not something we give to someone else. It's something that we do for ourselves. But mercy is something we give or do not give when we have the power to do so. These are complicated stories about complex realities found in the tangled jungle of our hearts and minds. These are two stories and a poem, but they will only begin to unravel all this complexity. So that's what I got for now, except to offer you peace and to invite you to both receive and give it yourself. Peace be with you. That was beautiful, Lisa.